You are indeed watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side Live. I'm one of your hosts, Eugene Pierre, here as always, alongside Rania Khalek. Rania, as always, it is very nice to be back with you.
Great to be on with you, Eugene. So many crazy stories we have lined up for the day.
There's so many wild stories out in the world today. Of course, we're going to be talking about the tragic situation with Haitian migrants on the border. We're going to be talking about a story that's actually been flying under the radar, but an important one, and that's about sanctions as it regards the country of Nicaragua and upcoming elections there in Nicaragua, which will be quite significant, certainly for Central America and the broader shift of the political spectrum in Latin America. We're also going to be talking with some Black Lives Matter activists from upstate New York, the Albany area, where there have been, perhaps unsurprisingly for many, ridiculous police raids and arrests and harassment of those who are fighting police brutality, police murders, and racism in police departments in that area. So certainly what seems like some retaliatory actions. And then, of course, we will also be discussing the row, as it were, that has emerged in terms of the United States, France, Australia, the United Kingdom, the new Cold War with China. It's a lot all sort of wrapped up in there, but we will untangle all of that with Vijay Prashad a little later on in the show. So we've got plenty for you here on the show, as we always do. And we want to just take a quick moment here to remind folks who may be watching on YouTube, go ahead and hit that subscription button. Also, make sure that you hit the bell so you can get all of the great content that's coming out from us here on Breakthrough News. So subscribe, hit the bell, get the alerts. And wherever you may be watching, make sure you hit that share button so whoever is following you can follow us. And also just a quick reminder that you can make a donation in the YouTube chat via Super Chat. And if our censor, Rania Khalek, deems it to be readable, we will indeed read out whatever message you send. So don't forget that you can do that. But we want to jump right into it. And the first story today, and I think this is a story that obviously has caught so many headlines, and that is the expulsion of Haitian migrants from Del Rio, Texas, by the Border Patrol. Of course, images that really caught just almost everyone around the world. Stunning images of Border Patrol agents on horsebacks whipping Haitian migrants. I know that there's been some back and forth about whether or not it was technically a whip or whatever, but we saw it. We know what happened. And of course, all of the ripple effects coming from that. So we are very honored to be joined here again on the Freedom Side by Jemima Pierre, who is the Haiti coordinator for Black Alliance for Peace and also an associate professor at the University of California, Los Angeles. Jemima, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Well, we're very happy to have you here. It's hard to even know where to start with this story. It's so tragic on so many different ways. It's also outrageous on so many levels, infuriating on so many levels. So maybe the first question I will ask you here is, what do you think is motivating the Biden administration as it concerns the actions they've taken here in Del Rio?
Besides racism?
Well, that's certainly one, but if there's something else, go right ahead.
Well, I think part of it is, the story first broke with the Fox News reporter, having his saying that, the FAA closed the airspace around the area because his drones could not capture the pictures of these, hordes, right? This immigrants. So part of that, I think, was the scary effect, right? Scary effect, all these Black hordes invading Texas. And we know what that meant. And so all of a sudden you have Governor Abbott closing borders and these Republicans making a big deal. And of course, Biden is not Biden is also, to me, racist. And so, it's just like he has to act decisively to get rid of these hordes. So the Blackness of these immigrants, right? The hordes are, it's like, we're going to expose, get rid of them immediately so that this is not a problem. So I think the spectacle of it, the Blackness of the immigrant, but the spectacle of the horses and so on, the whips, is really what's pushing this, was pushing this story. Whereas I think, there's a bigger, much bigger problem And this is a result of a long-term problem. So, I mean, we can talk about that as well.
No, absolutely. Well, I slightly buried the lead here. I forgot we had this clip, so I apologize. But Jen Psaki, who is the spokesperson for President Biden, White House press coordinator, she was on CBS Morning News the other day, and they were asking her about this. And I want to just play some of what she had to say and get your response in terms of their response, I guess.
What did the president say? How did he feel when he saw them?
He also felt they were horrific and horrible. I don't know anyone who could watch that video and not have that emotion. Last night, our Secretary of Homeland Security put out a statement conveying there'd be an investigation, that he's going to send additional personnel. And I think it's important for people to know this is not who we are. That's not who the Biden-Harris administration is. And we're going to absolutely pursue that investigation and get to the bottom of what happened here. Right now, we also have to implement our laws at the border. We also want to protect people, both in that community, but also migrants. One of the challenges, as we're all facing a pandemic here, is the gathering of so many people. We're still implementing Title 42, which means that we are going to send people out of the country who come in as we implement that. But again, as we look to the photos, not just the ones you referenced, but of all of these families and people under the bridges, we wanted to also take steps to implement our laws and to protect a lot of them from the spread of COVID as well.
Well, there it is. They want to protect people, in Jen Psaki's words there. Jemima Pierre, your response?
Well, there are two things. It's respect the laws. The laws of asylum states that you can go up to any nation. This is U.S. law as well as international law, and request asylum. You have the right as a human being to do that. And so that already is an illegal process that she's talking about. But, the specter of disease, Black people and disease, or non-white people bringing disease into the country is the perfect dog whistle, right, for white supremacists talking points, right? And this is the Democrats, so people don't want to call it white supremacists, but that's what it is, right? We have to remember that the CDC labeled Haitians HIV/AIDS carriers back in the late 80s, early 90s, right, as a way to put them in Guantanamo Bay, so to keep them from coming to the U.S. And so we have to remember that, even though we know that they were coming because the U.S. backed the coup d'etat against their elected president back in 1991. So this is a repeating story, right? And so I think, of course, these press secretaries are always hypocritical. They're liars. They're disingenuous. And so Jen Psaki's, they're saving space. They're trying to save face because the images, the spectacle is so terrible. But what's been going on, what the Biden, Trump, Obama, Bush, Clinton administrations have been doing in Haiti have all been, that what they've been doing in Haiti is horrific and racist. And so the only reason they're speaking up now is because it looks, the optics are bad.
Well, I'm glad you brought up that issue of the long history and the U.S. policy in Haiti. And of course, the U.S. Special Envoy to Haiti resigned today as well. I just want to mention that for those who are following the story. But just quickly shout out Abu Huram, who did donate in the super chat, who I think asked a question that sort of speaks to some of this, asking, isn't there some U.S. complicity essentially in the recent assassination of Jovenel Moise, the former de facto president, so-called president of Haiti, and isn't there some broader U.S. complicity in this whole situation, I think is what he's trying to say. And I think that does seem like a little bit of the important background to understanding this, because there's another question of why there has been a surge in migrants from Haiti in and of itself, which feels like a big piece of this.
Right. And so I have to say, a lot of people are probably just assuming that these Haitians just jumped in the water and swam to Texas. And so that's not the case. It's not that easy to get there. These people have been there for years. And this is directly a result of U.S. policy, U.S. foreign policy across the Americas. And so we have to remember that the reason there's so many people there at the first time is because Obama started this process of metering, which is like limiting the number of people that can come up to declare asylum, and having people wait months and years in Mexico in order to actually come up to the border for asylum. So what Trump did was make it even worse by creating the Remain in Mexico policy. And so then, even when you do, after waiting weeks and months to get an appointment to declare asylum, you have to wait in Mexico while your process goes through the courts, right? Which could take years. So these numbers, and actually, if you go to Tijuana, there are camps there. There are different groups there are thousands of people in the Guatemala-Mexico border, because the Mexican government is also complicit. And so this is like immigration policy. But then the reason the Haitians are going through South America, through Central America to get here is because the US-backed coup d'etat in 2004, which destroyed the Haitian state. And then 2011, the installation of the PHTK government, Martelly, and then Moïse, which then really consolidated the destruction. And I have to say, the reason they're coming from Brazil in particular, because Brazil led the armed wing, the military wing of the UN occupation of Haiti, and then gave Haitians some residential permits to come work as cheap labor for the Olympics and the World Cup. And so then when there's an economic downturn, people then walk and drive or whatever they have to do over 7 countries overland to get to the US. So all this is a result of Western and US imperialism. The reason these people are there, some of them haven't been to Haiti in years. They're there. They are here because the U.S. is there. And we have to be very clear about that. And I have to say one more thing, and I don't want to talk too much, but
no, please.
There are more than Haitians at the border. And I hate the exceptionalizing of Haitians, because to do that is to really diminish what the U.S. has done, U.S. imperialism throughout the entire region. So there are Africans there, there are Black Colombians. So among the Black migrants, there are Africans, Colombians, Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, and we forget that. In fact, 2 years ago, some thousands of Africans released a statement about their treatment by the Mexican government, right? So how did these Africans get here? Why are we exceptionalizing Haitians? And I think it's important. The spectacle is terrible, but the racism that they're encountering in Mexico by U.S. immigration, that's more than Haitians. That's the Haitians. That's also our brown brothers and sisters who also bear the brunt of immigration law. So I want us to actually think about this, and actually the critique should be against U.S. imperialism and actions in the region and the complicity of these neo-colonial states for allowing the U.S. border to be beyond Mexico, because we might as well call the U.S. border in Colombia as well, because the U.S. policy goes through these borders. That's why we have groups of migrants everywhere all over South America.
No,
I think there's also I think there's also an element to this of the reaction. And while the reaction was horrified because of the images coming out and sort of the historical context that is like put in people's minds when they see, authorities on horseback, essentially what looks like, whipping Black people, that seems to be what horrified everybody. At the same time, you have this happening under Biden. You have, I believe, under this Title 42 law that Trump enacted, Biden has actually deported like 3 times as many people under this law.
690,000 people.
Wow.
Right. And of course, that's an insane number.
In 9 months.
And of course, he has less time than Trump had, I believe, this law. So it's actually insane. And I feel like a part of it is also the fact that it's happening under a Democrat. Like, I feel like if this had been happening under Trump, people would be calling it fascism. People would be calling out the white supremacy of it. And instead we see Jen Psaki on TV trying to sort of defend it. And you definitely see a more muted response. Like, how do we deal with that? How do we deal with the fact that people seem to be okay with this stuff when it's happening under Democrats? And of course it's happening under Democrats because this is just our system under whichever party's in charge.
No, you're absolutely right. It's difficult. And this is why Glenn Ford, bless his soul, used to call the Democrats the more effective evil, because they can get away with so much more than can a Trump. Right now, if Biden keeps this track record, this track of deporting, remember, Obama still deported more people than any other president before him, 3 million people. So we have to remember that. So it is, Democrats get away with it. U.S. policy is imperialist and racist, period. No matter who's president, no matter who's in charge, no matter which party is in charge. This is the story of the U.S. empire. And so until we get beyond that, and also until we stop exceptionalizing the Haiti case, for me, and I'm a Haitian person, and I feel pain watching this, but I do think what this does is further exceptionalize Haitians and removes them from the discussion of U.S. imperialism. So the truth is, there's more relationship of the way Haitian migrants are being treated with the ways that people from Afghanistan are being treated, people who need, asylum because of the 20-year brutal occupation of Afghanistan. We have to see those links between U.S. imperialism and the treatment of people, the victims of empire. They're all victims of empire. And if we keep exceptionalizing this, we forget the larger story, which is the story we should be focusing on, and which is the story we should be condemning, and not to diminish anti-Blackness, but we have to talk about all these things together.
No, I think it's an important point. And I mean, obviously tying it into empire, there's the reports that have come out of the actually existing prior to this, they're trying to build a new migrant detention center at Guantanamo Bay. And they had said that one of the languages they wanted to have guards use were Haitian Creole. Now, this, of course, predates this crisis, and the Biden administration has been at great pains to say, oh, no, we're not going to send anyone there. They've just already been planning to send Haitians there. But be that as it may, I think it's a very visceral connection to the broader issue of empire and the broader issue of U.S. policy. And I mentioned it briefly before, but I wonder how you take this special envoy resigning. He had many negative things to say. I believe he's now saying, the U.S. policy was bad and they never listened to me. I don't know. But it certainly had a CYA kind of element to it, to me, in terms of, just Google that if you don't know what it means. But either way, Jemima, I'm curious what you think about this individual, Mr. Foote, and his resignation.
Well, I mean, it is extraordinary in the sense that you have this person resign and be so blatant in his contempt and in its criticism of the government that put him in place, which is extraordinary. At the same time, Daniel Foote does not have a great track record in the Foreign Service. If people can look that up, and so it's really interesting to see that. But he also, even as in the end, he says the U.S. has been intervening and so on. The first three paragraphs are reiterating or restating all the tropes and stereotypes of Haiti as this violent place and it seems as if this violent is like, created by Haitians. That area is like, violence is endemic. And so Haitians are always already violent. So I hate the stereotypical representations of Haitians as there, because the reality is the violence is linked to the U.S. destabilizing of the Haitian state from the very beginning. And so yes, I think it's important that he resigns. And I think he makes some good points in the last paragraph. And I also think this is a result of the U.S., him not getting along with the head of the core group. And so they're saying they barely met while he was there. And the truth is, it is the core group, that stands behind Ariel Henry, who the prosecutor wanted to indict and who should probably be indicted. And so I think they did not come to it. And so this is the first time you do see a split between the core group and the U.S. State Department. And I'm all for that, because they all need to just get the hell out of Haiti. Sorry, they all need to get the heck out of Haiti. And leave Haiti alone. So I like that, what that represents, similar to the way I like, France and the US fighting over that white supremacist pact with Australia. But that's a separate story. But the point is that, Daniel Foote really does replicate the stereotypes of the racist stuff about Haiti. But I do think it's an important move. And I hope it pushes some people who refuses to deal with US imperialism and the past 17 years, especially of disruption of the Haitian state. I hope that will force them to go back and look at that. And we also have to point to the toothless release of the first statement by the Congressional Black Caucus. The first time they said anything about policy in Haiti, and I'm just like, well, where were you when the state was being dismantled? Where were you when Martelly was being imposed, when Jovenel Moïse was being imposed? You haven't said anything about U.S. policy in Haiti, and it also is as if it's almost giving the administration cover, to save Biden, because it opens up the space to actually help Biden save himself, as opposed to really being critical of what the Democratic Party has done, and Biden in particular. But then again, we know they won't criticize the Democratic Party, so we are where we are.
Yeah, no, of course. I think that's a very good point. It also reminds me of Kamala Harris when she was asked about it. I was like, oh, this just seems terrible. We never should do that. And I was just like, I mean, as if you're just a person on the street being asked what you think about this, not the vice president of the United States. And I know the vice president has no technical power, but to me, it just spoke to the whole ridiculousness of the position of the Democrats trying to have their cake and eat it too. And I think the complicity of U.S. policy is so clear. I mean, I'm glad you brought up the issue too, even obliquely of Dr. Henry and this prosecutor. I mean, that seems to me to also speak to the role of the core group here, that you've got the so-called leader of the country is, at least allegedly, calling the night of the assassination the head of the assassination plot twice. The prosecutor says, "Can I question you?" And he says, "Actually, not only can you not question me, you're fired." I mean, it's unbelievable in so many ways, but it's like you could only do that when you feel like, well, who's going to care what I do?
Exactly. And he has no mandate, and people have to remember Daniel Henry, the U.S. loves him. He's the perfect puppet because he came in 2004 as the leader of the Council of Sages to consolidate that coup. So then this is what we mean by, the Haiti does not have a sovereign state. There's no sovereignty in Haiti. And until we get that in our minds, we cannot move forward without acknowledging that this is where we are so that we can fight against it and regain independence, because that's where we are.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jemima, as always, I really appreciate you being willing to join us here and help us sort through all these issues and put all this critical context in play here. Again, Jemima Pierre, Haiti coordinator for Black Alliance for Peace, also an assistant professor at UCLA. Thanks so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much for having me.
No,
Take
of
care.
course. Well, Rhonda, I thought that was the perfect context for this. And I really thought, to me, the thing that spoke to the most about this, and, coming up here, we're going to be talking about Nicaragua in just a little bit. And of course, we will be talking about the Asia Pacific and this U.S. nuclear submarines in Australia, or Australian nuclear submarines from the U.K. But the reason I referenced Nicaragua is sort of the Americas-wide nature of this immigration crisis, and just the thought of people moving from Haiti to Brazil to Mexico, now trying to come to the United States, just to have the most basic decency and living standards because the U.S. has destroyed their country, and along with other countries.
Moreover, yeah, and moreover, and we've talked about this on the show before, but it's so important to reiterate, and because you mentioned we're going to be talking about Nicaragua. You have countries across Latin America where people are fleeing violence. They're fleeing destabilization that's largely backed by the U.S. They're fleeing economic deterioration, also a result of U.S. policy. And it's often, not in every case, but almost always, the vast majority are fleeing regimes backed by the U.S., regimes that are puppets of the U.S., countries that really have very little sovereignty because they're either U.S. client states or they're bullied by the U.S. into, being neoliberal hellholes, really. And then you look at a country like Nicaragua, which we're going to be talking about shortly, and it is probably one of the safest, most peaceful countries in Latin America. And the U.S. right now, there aren't migrants coming to the U.S. from Nicaragua. It's not. It's Honduras. It's Haiti. It's not Nicaragua. It's El Salvador. And so when we talk about refugees fleeing, we need to not only attach it to U.S. imperialism, but we need to talk about ongoing U.S. imperialism, because right now, as we speak, the U.S. is attempting to destabilize Nicaragua, the one country that remains safe and peaceful in Latin America. The U.S. is trying to destabilize it and turn it into another Haiti and another El Salvador and another Honduras. And so we have to be talking about these places all in connection with each other, because this is really a war against the entire region of Latin America. And this is just one little symptom of it. One horrifying symptom of it is these images coming out from the border.
No, I think so, for sure. And El Salvador, who people aren't watching with, is just a macabre drama going on where the president is trying to turn El Salvador into the hub for cryptocurrency, like the hub of the world for cryptocurrency, which is, basically fake anyway. But so many countries around the world now cracking down on crypto, and President Bukele is making this huge deal now of crypto. So I don't want to go off on some whole thing, but I mean, given the just terrible situation for so many people in El Salvador. It's unbelievable that this is like the great element of it. And I think, yeah, I mean, it's a war on all of Latin America. I mean, Jemima had also mentioned Colombia, and which is, of course, the most social activists killed every single year, and Honduras and Guatemala. And I mean, that was Kamala Harris, who we mentioned earlier on Haiti. Oh, it sounds so terrible. I honestly, I can't get over that. How can you be the vice president and someone says, this administration is doing this really terrible thing, what do you think? And you really do act like you were just some innocent bystander. It really is disgusting on so many different levels. And the DHS head, who like the night of the thing was like, yeah, we're being real tough. And then the next morning was like, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening. We're investigating. I mean, come on.
This is Democrats for you, though. This is what they do. They tweet. The Democrats tweet and make empty statements. Like every day I see tweets from Joe Biden. It's like everyone should have access to healthcare. I'm like, you are the president of the United States. Like, why are you tweeting this? Do something about it. Or like just these empty, like everybody should have this. Everybody should have that. And it's like, okay, again, president. And I mean, everybody does it. All these senators and people in Congress, they're like, we have to stop wars. It's like, why don't you put up a bill to stop the war? Like, I don't know. Like you're not just like, maybe we should get this person elected to Congress so they can do something about it. I mean, it's every day. It's every single day. I see these like the viral tweets. I'm like, your job is, please go write an amendment. Like, go gather your people together and make something happen. You are in a position of power. Please.
It's strange that you have to say that. You would think if you were in a position of power and been elected on certain issues, like, I don't know, helping immigrants, that you might in fact do it. But, you know, we can also see that they're getting ready to let, almost certainly, I mean, we'll see, I could be wrong about this, but they're willing to let the, you know, so-called parliamentarians' rules that aren't rules, actually. They're just guidelines. They are rulings on rules that, in fact, the Senate makes for themselves. They're going to use that as a fig leaf to drop a path to legalization for 8 million immigrants out of the budget reconciliation bill. So, I mean, we see whether it's at the border, whether it's in the halls of Congress, despite the fact that a huge amount of time, money, energy, effort is spent in these elections to convince, well, all of us who are for the rights of migrants that they're going to do something. We see that when the rubber meets the road, that's not really the case. And I just really quickly here, since we're ripping Joe Biden, also want to rip another executive, Governor Greg Abbott of Texas.
Please.
Who has put together the steel wall at the border. They've just lined up a bunch of trucks. And they're like, yeah, we have a steel wall and we're preventing these migrants from coming in. I mean, it's the dumbest, most performative thing you've ever seen. I mean, they're already deporting thousands of these people via plane every day. And by the way, even though they're saying they're only doing adults, from the flight manifest, and this comes from Jake Johnston from the Center for Economic and Policy Research, that when you look at the flight manifest, a significant number of people being sent back to Haiti are families with children. So don't be fooled. But it's sort of like after the fact, Abbott comes and sets up this steel wall, which is not a steel wall. It's not even a wall. It's just like a bunch of trucks lined up. I mean, if like 100 people ran at these trucks all at once, they could get through. It's not a wall. But, you know, some of them are Hummers. It's just, what are you doing? But obviously this is Greg Abbott, governor of Texas, who's just terrible in every way.
Well, on that note, we have a super chat.
Excellent.
That is a good. I'm allowing it to go through. But thank you from Christopher Cotton. Thank you, Christopher. He says, thanks for the deeper dive on the migrants. Really appreciate y'all's coverage and perspectives. Thank you. And actually, I think this is a good time to plug one of our pieces of content. My very, very, very first episode of my show, Rania Khalek Dispatches for Breakthrough News, was on this very topic of the immigration refugee issue. It's like a 30-minute long deep dive into like the immigration crisis, what's behind it, how come it seems to happen regardless of which, you know, party is in charge. And so I highly recommend people go check that out. It's it's on our website. Just look up Rania Khalek Dispatches Breakthrough News and migrants or refugees, and you should be able to find it. But on that note, Eugene, it looks like No, I'm wrong. Never mind.
Yeah.
Forget what I said.
Yeah.
On that note, I can say, no, but one thing I do want to say though, is something that interesting that has happened in the last few days. I don't know if you've been paying attention to it. I'm sure you have, is there's been the UN General Assembly,
Yes.
where the head of every state is getting to speak. And I don't know if you've had a chance to see some of the interesting comments from various leaders of countries that are being targeted by the U.S., from Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, from the Cuban ambassador, from I think Pedro Castillo spoke as well, and on and on. And they've all been making very interesting and harsh comments against this U.S. attack on their region, against Cuba, against Venezuela. And they seem to be kind of forming an alliance as well as with the head of Mexico, AMLO, where they're really pushing back, I think, in a pretty, significant way, where you have a number of leftist or left-leaning leaders who are kind of like backing each other and supporting each other. I mean, Nicolas Maduro was recently at like a meeting with all the other heads of states of Latin America, where he actually kind of like talked crap directly to them, to the right-wing leaders of various Latin American countries that are like joining the U.S. and attacking him. So I think we're kind of in an interesting moment where in various regions, whether it's Latin America or whether it's the Middle East, where you have this growing regional alliance, I'm not even talking internationally, regional alliance where you've got like Hezbollah, Iran, the Houthis in Yemen, the PMF in Iraq, the Palestinian resistance across Palestine, really like being united in a way like never before, where they're able to like stand up to American and Israeli and Saudi imperialism. You have this happening in Latin America. You have this growing influence of China pushing back very strongly for the first time since I can remember against U.S. aggression. So I think we're kind of entering a new era of international politics, where it's not just the sort of natural decline of U.S. empire because it's like sabotaging itself, but you also see a rise of a sort of international level of resistance to it that I think is quite exciting.
No, it's quite interesting. Pedro Castillo, by the way, who walked out of Bolsonaro's speech, and Bolsonaro, who, I don't know if people saw, but it's worth looking up a photo of him on the sidewalk eating pizza because he's unvaccinated. And in New York State, you have to be vaccinated to eat inside. So he had no choice but to take his slice to the outside. But no, I think that's a good point. And it's worth noting that there is an official group now at the United Nations, Friends of the UN Charter, which was initiated by Venezuela, also by China. There's a number of different countries that are there. But swinging back around here to Central America, we do want to go to the issue of Nicaragua. And we are very happy to be joined here by Jill Clark Gollub, who is an activist with Friends of Latin America. Jill, thank you so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much for having me, Eugene and Rania.
Well, the pleasure is all ours. And I think that many people, I think, in the United States probably are not paying any attention at all to what's happening in Nicaragua, unfortunately. So maybe just give us some context about the upcoming elections that are happening in Nicaragua and maybe the general relationship between the United States and the Nicaraguan government.
Well, ever since the Sandinistas first came to power, and even before then, the United States has been an enemy of them. I'm talking about 1979, when a popular revolution in Nicaragua overthrew the Somoza dictatorship that the U.S. had been propping up for 45 years. And as people may remember, throughout the 1980s, the Reagan administration and then the first Bush administration trained, funded, and basically directed the Contra War against the people of Nicaragua, which led the Nicaraguan people to vote out the FSLN in 1990, despite all the progress that had been made over those previous 10, 11 years. And then they experienced 16 years of the kind of government the U.S. wanted. And in 2000, end of 2006 and 2007, the Nicaraguan people voted back in the FSLN government, the Sandinista party, and they've been in power for 14 and a half years now and made great progress. But even before Daniel Ortega got reelected in 2006, the U.S. and the parties that are favorable to the U.S., or not all of them, some of them have been calling Daniel Ortega a dictator. and there's been a lot of hostility, and it's really coming to a crescendo now with the election that's going to take place on November 7th. And it's leaked from the U.S. Embassy in Managua that there's a new coup plot to targeting the elections in Nicaragua. And it seems like the main tactic is that because it seems so apparent that the FSLN will win again easily, they're running 2-to-1 support for the FSLN compared to the opposition, that the tactic is to delegitimize those elections. And that's what we see happening right now.
Well, I appreciate that context. And tell us about these new sanctions that the United States is potentially placing on Nicaragua, which I think also sort of comes in train with quite a bit of long existing destabilization efforts.
Yes, right. So now Nicaragua, or the U.S. plans against the Nicaraguan government have gone to the economic warfare stage. And there were initially sanctions implemented at the end of 2018 called the Nika Act, which said that the United States had to veto any projects or loans for Nicaragua from the multilateral development institutions. And in fact, Nicaragua didn't get any aid from the World Bank or the IDB, any new aid during all of 2019, and nothing till the end of 2020, when it became so apparent that there had to be some pandemic aid and also relief after the 2 major hurricanes that hit Nicaragua the hardest in Central America. But still, again, Nicaragua got much less than its neighbors. And so this new package put forward in Congress is targeted sanctions, which, as some of your listeners may not be aware, sanctions are actually not as nice as the American public is come to believe. Like, it's a nice alternative to warfare. In fact, sanctions cause a lot of death and suffering because people can't get access to food and medicines and other things that you need from being connected to the rest of the world. And also people believe that when sanctions are targeted, that they only hurt the bad dictators or whatever corrupt people are stealing money from the people in that country. But this package, it's really a misnomer to call it targeted, because first of all, it targets the whole of government. And how can the Ministry of Health import supplies that they need for healthcare and medicines if the whole of government is targeted? And how can people living in the country not feel the impact of a government that's unable to provide these services and infrastructure? And all of the police and army are targeted, and so is the largest and most popular legal party in the country, which is the FSLN, the Sandinista Party, which has over 2.1 million card-carrying members. So that's in a population of 6.5 million. So it's about 1/3 of the whole population is in this party, and then their family members would be targeted as well. So the targets include over half of the Nicaraguan population.
Wow. You know, one thing I also wanted to ask you about, I read a piece that you had a little earlier this year, I believe, I read it in Popular Resistance, that, I mean, honestly blew my mind in terms of the amount of U.S., you know, I guess democracy promotion, they call it, but you might call it meddling. What would ultimately be the equivalent of billions of dollars in the U.S. if it was proportionate to the population and the GDP. Talk about that if you could, because I mean, I certainly heard in general about this, but the scale I thought was astonishing.
Yes, thank you, Eugene. Yeah, what I did in that article is I took just one source of money that we're aware of because it's publicly on the USAID website. And that's just money that USAID provided to democracy supporting, which is a code word for regime change projects in Nicaragua. So that's just one agency that's in the NED, CIA architecture, and that's publicly on the books. And that came out to over $24 per person in Nicaragua, because it was over 160 million. Now, that's not counting from the Soros Foundation and from other sources of funding. And if you compare that's on 6.5 million people. And this is in a country that, although poverty has been greatly reduced, people don't have a lot of cash on hand. The GDP of the country is pretty small. And that's why Nicaragua has ranked as the second poorest in the Americas in recent years. A sad fact that's also related to this topic of sanctions is that now Venezuela, who has been one of the better off countries of the Americas, because of sanctions, Venezuela has sunk to be poorer than Nicaragua. That's just a side note. But so anyways, Nicaragua's GDP is about 12 billion, whereas the US is like 21 trillion. So if you extrapolate these amounts of money, it's like the US population at $24, I know the number was somewhere in the billions. And if you compare GDP, it's in the hundreds of billions. And can you imagine? I mean, there's no other country on the planet that would have the capacity to do this to most countries. But if you could imagine if some other country had the resources and they did that in the United States, this would certainly be felt. And this was certainly part of the inspiration for passing a law that's very much like the Foreign Agent Registration Act of the United States, which requires NGOs that receive foreign funding to report that funding, show how it was used, and refrain from using it for political purposes. And that's what Nicaragua did. And it's very ironic that the text of the Renacer Act, which I would argue is in itself a piece of information warfare, because it is so full of these unsubstantiated accusations. But one of the things that it says is, and not in so many words, that the FSLN members of the Nicaraguan legislature need to be punished because they had the gall to pass a law that doesn't allow NGOs to take money from outside the country for political activity. So apparently the authors of this never heard of the Russiagate scandal in the United States.
Well, it's amazing. It's amazing because essentially Nicaragua is trying to shut down U.S. attempts to destabilize it. And this is the U.S. way of punishing them for that. But very quickly, Jill, I wanted to ask you if you could comment, because a part of this act is accusing, it goes along with all this propaganda we've been hearing over the last several months in U.S. media that, Daniel Ortega, ahead of these elections, he's throwing opposition activists in jail. And of course, these reports provide zero context of who these people are. Did they actually commit a crime? Is that maybe why they were put in jail? And I mean, I even saw this cast. I don't know if you saw this. There was the cast of this popular teen drama that I'm sure none of you have ever heard of because you're not teenagers and you probably don't watch stupid shows, but it's called Riverdale. And the entire cast got together and made this video talking about how one of the fathers of one of the writers on the show is being held by dictator Daniel Ortega ahead of elections, and pleased to, it was all over Instagram. It was all over Twitter. The the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee thanked them in a tweet. So here these are young actors and actresses who are actually pretty progressive on U.S. domestic issues. A lot of them are very, pro BLM and anti-racist. Supported the George Floyd protest. So it's just interesting to see how deep this kind of propaganda goes, where even well-intentioned, progressives in the U.S. don't know any better. But my question for you is, can you give some context to what we're hearing about these opposition activists being put in jail, and how is that related to the U.S. attempted coup that nobody in America really knows about from April of 2018, which was also reported in U.S. media as being some sort of democratic uprising, when in fact it was quite the opposite?
Yes, very quickly, Rania. What you were just saying reminds me of what a good friend and another activist and Friends of Latin America said, is that the people in the United States are the most propagandized people in the world. But that show for teenagers just really tells you how deep that it goes. But yes, very quickly, 2018, and I would just say that this is very similar to what was done in Cuba, in July of this year. Fortunately, in Cuba, there was not as much violence. It was curtailed more quickly. And I'm certainly sure that the people of Cuba learned from the Nicaraguan experience. But yes, there were, I've heard between 2,000 and 8,000 young people recruited, particularly through Catholic Church organizations, to be social media influencers, and some of them did not know what they were being recruited for. Some were fine with it, and they came out for protests against the Social Security system, which is not what young people or students usually rally around. And there was a narrative created that this was going to make people pay more, and there's another narrative that Daniel Ortega isn't progressive or socialist, that he's capitalist, and he was implementing an IMF kind of package. The opposite is true. He was protecting the Nicaraguan people. And in fact, there had been 10 years of peaceful government with consensus between the big business sector, the trade unions, and the government. And this was the point when the government finally broke with it, because they refused to kick some people out of the Social Security system and make people pay more for their health and pension insurance. And so this was the response of the business sector and other people who were probably in cahoots with the United States to put out this false narrative, to send people into the streets, and then start saying that the police was killing people. The Nicaraguan, there was a national dialogue. The opposition at that dialogue said that, demanded for the police to stay in their barracks and also for the president to step down immediately. So it quickly changed from a narrative of Social Security reform to you have to leave now. And just to make a long story short, the police actually were sent back to their barracks, and the Nicaraguan people were able to see who was really perpetrating the violence. And there were roadblocks that basically brought the economy to a standstill, but thanks to Nicaragua's small producers food movement, people did not go hungry, which is, I'm sure, what the people who invented these roadblocks hoped would happen. But the narrative that was spun, and this is also very much part of this foreign funding, and the Gray Zone has some excellent articles to help you follow this. But while they talk about no press freedom and no freedom of speech, there is a big network of opposition media outlets in Nicaragua, more than there are pro-government ones. And many of them have been funded and created by the United States. Those, in turn, are picked up by The Guardian, by the BBC, Washington Post, New York Times, Reuters, and echoed throughout the world. And that is how we have the world of post-truth and operation in Nicaragua. And what you were saying about the LGBT thing, that's another thing. These identity politics are also turned on their head. Friends of Latin America went on a delegation to Nicaragua in January of 2020. We stayed with a beautiful peasant women's community for part of our stay. We learned about the progress that they are making in changing a culture, traditional Latin culture of machismo, into more equal relations. By the way, Nicaragua ranks number 5 in the world for gender equality, according to different measures. And we learned about how they're making inroads into more acceptance of LGBT, and all. This is not a part of Nicaraguan culture. The Nicaraguan culture is not where the United States is on these things, but they're making great progress, and they have the support of their government in doing so.
Well, no, thank you, Jill, for that. And quick shout out to our friend Ben Norton, who I know is on the ground there and doing a lot of that reporting for the Gray Zone. But, one thing I also want to ask you that I think is very relevant about this, and you already spoke to it in your earlier comments, is that the Sandinistas are quite popular, and they almost certainly, I don't think there's anyone anywhere who doesn't believe that they are not going to win handily. Talk a little bit about the policies of the Nicaraguan government and why people are generally so supportive of the process there.
Well, I'm just looking at some statistics. They've reduced maternal mortality, infant mortality, and malnutrition by about 2/3 for all of those categories. And they were one of the first to reach all of the Millennium Development Goals and exceed them. They have achieved 90% food sovereignty. That is to say, they grow 90% of the food that they consume, and they have a very strong peasant movement that's part of La Via Campesina and is building food sovereignty, which means you give land and you don't let agribusiness run the food system in your country, and that's really thriving. They have given autonomy and land and self-government to the indigenous and Afro-descendant people of the Caribbean coast region, part of the country. That's about 1/3 of the country's territory. And this autonomy was granted in 1987 with the new constitution. It stagnated during the 16 years of neoliberal government, but now it is thriving, and there are different levels of government. They have their own universities, they have instruction in their native languages, and also people have been given electricity and running water and health services. 21 hospitals have been built since this government came in office 14 years ago. And just really quickly, they've increased the number of doctors by over 100%. They've increased healthcare spending. They've had very good results with the COVID-19 pandemic so far. And actually, somebody was just sharing some statistics today. Nicaraguan women have the highest health and survival rate in the world, the highest education rate in the world. The right wing and the U.S. are constantly saying, and the Renacer Act says this, that the country is corrupt. But this is a country that does not have the high violence rate that you see in their northern neighbors. Its homicide rate is far better than Costa Rica's, which American tourists go to all the time. It's actually just 7 per 100,000. It's very close to that of the United States. And this is because the country's done a good job keeping out drug traffickers. And they went from having the worst roads in Central America to having the best, and some of the best in all of Latin America, one of the safest countries in all of Latin America. And so these accusations of corruption, to me, they ring really hollow, not only because the U.S.'s closest allies are the narco governments of Honduras and Colombia, but also because you can see what the money is being spent on in Nicaragua. You see these beautiful highways, you see these beautiful hospitals, you see schools, you see kids who have school uniforms. They're given school uniforms and backpacks. And as somebody who was just in Nicaragua recently told me, I can't believe that it costs, just like less than $1 or 50 cents, I don't know what the exact exchange rate would be, to ride a bus. The bus is heavily subsidized. So all of these things have made life much easier. And it's for the rich. No, maybe these sanctions and being at odds with the United States don't make life as easy for them. But for the majority of Nicaraguans, it's made a huge improvement in their lives.
I mean, it's an amazing standout in Central America where there's, so many tragic scenes we see all the time. Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador. I mean, Rania mentioned this earlier. I mean, Nicaragua seems to be essentially the only country where tens of thousands of people aren't fleeing en masse. It seems, month on month, basically, to come to the United States. And it just... obviously, I'm not that surprised the U.S. government isn't giving them credit and aid and help and other things like that. But it still seems outrageous to me, Jill, that there is such a double standard where, you know, if you're Mr. Giamatti in Guatemala, you can just do whatever you want to do. You can sanction genocide by dismissing the judges who are investigating it, and no one's going to do anything. Kamala Harris will fly there and meet with you and give you money. But Nicaragua, it's like the exact opposite. I mean, the hypocrisy there is just huge.
Yes, I agree with you.
Well, let me just ask you this. I don't know. I mean, you never know. Does it feel almost like a fait accompli that the U.S. will be able to get some of these sanctions in on Nicaragua? Is there a struggle going on and that perhaps people can or should engage in that could push this back?
Yes, I very much would like to encourage people to go to the website of the Alliance for Global Justice, and you can also follow Friends of Latin America on Twitter and our website. But afgj.org, you can look for an action item. So what's happened with the Renacer Act is that unfortunately it did pass the Senate, a version of it that would need to be reconciled with the House. And there are two committees. I'm not sure if I think there's also the Justice Committee, but that's pretty much the same membership as Foreign Affairs, but it had to pass Foreign Affairs, which it did pass. Financial Services, it needs to pass. And Congresswoman Maxine Waters is the chair of that committee. And we have been asking people to keep calling her. And so far, this has been working. Call her number. I'm sorry, I don't have it to read to you right now, but afgj.org, and tell her to please do not bring it to a vote. Do not let it come out of the committee. That is our best chance for defeating this. Because as we know from watching Venezuela and Cuba, once these sanctions are passed, it is so hard to roll them back. And we know that sanctions discourage direct foreign investment. They hurt the economy. They cause people to lose jobs. And they, as this also sanctionskill.org can tell you about sanctions, we need to get the American public to realize that sanctions are war. They kill as surely as bullets and bombs because they destroy economies, cause hyperinflation and unemployment, so people cannot get basic necessities. They drive capital flight from countries as corporations and financial institutions seek to distance themselves. And there's this tremendous over-enforcement with everyone being told that they cannot run afoul of the United States or they will be subject to sanctions. So yes, please help us stop this, and please help us convince the American people that we cannot practice foreign policy through sanctions.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jill, Clark Gollub with Friends of Latin America, really, really honored with you joining us here today, and thank you so much for giving us a little bit of your time.
Thank you so much, Eugene and Rania.
The pleasure is all ours. Rania, obviously we have at least one, if not, 3 or 4 of these stories every week about the impact of U.S. policy abroad, the double standards, the hypocrisy. But this one, maybe it just feels a little bit more notable because it's, quote unquote, close to home. Ron, you appear to be muted.
I am. Oh, oops. Okay, I pressed the wrong thing. I'm sorry.
It
wouldn't be a Freedom Side Live without me doing something that lets everybody know how technologically illiterate I am. But what I was going to say before I muted
Donate
myself,
to the super chat so we can get Rania some tech assistance, like a class or something.
So I can learn to be more graceful on during my time.
It'll be like the My Fair
stream.
Lady of breakthrough news situation.
Exactly.
The rain in Spain falls mostly on the plain. Come on,
What I was going to say here is, I saw a video of AOC yesterday saying something very important that I was happy she said. I can't remember. The context was about this current situation with Title 42 that we were talking about at the beginning of the show, that was sparked by the issue of, Haitian refugees being chased by border police on horseback. Is this issue of now is one of those moments where you can actually prevent what AOC was talking about in the video I saw, which is that these people are fleeing a lot of times because of the consequences of US foreign policy. And we need to keep connecting it to that, because we live in this country where the situation of refugees at the border, the crisis at the border, the fear of immigrants is constantly in our faces with zero context that this situation in Nicaragua can be that. That can be tens of thousands of Nicaraguans fleeing across the border to safety in the US because we destroyed their country if these sanctions are successful. So this is one of those moments where, like, I will say, like, call your representative. Like, do what you could do. Go to the websites that Jill mentioned, because like she said, once sanctions are passed, it is impossible, almost impossible, to undo them. And being in a region that is heavily sanctioned myself, the consequences suck. The consequences really suck, and it kills people.
Right. They're on everyone. I mean, anyone who's ever studied this or ever looked at this, the richest people are basically fine under sanctions. And in some cases, a lot of times they make more money because of the distortions that happen in the economy, and, you know, new billionaires will rise, exploiting, the high prices because people can't goods. It's the average everyday people who end up hurt by this. And I thought that was one of the things that Jill noted the most, I think is really important about this whole idea of targeted sanctions, is if you're in any country that has a significant public sector, I mean, even maybe not so significant, it becomes extremely difficult because the individuals who are involved in the negotiations and the various deals and elements of bringing money, food, other things into the country, moving exports out, are the people you have to deal with. And the way it starts to pile up, and this is one of the things that we see with the blockade of Cuba, is that, and really all sanctions, the U.S. will say, whoa, well, you know, we have these exceptions for humanitarian, medical, or whatever. But the companies themselves say, well, look, this is a Byzantine process. We're not 100% sure what's covered, not 100% sure what's not covered. You know, who exactly is sanctioned? So you know what? Let's just not even deal with it at all. And we've seen that in Cuba, we've seen that in Iran, where critical, life-saving medical equipment, cancer drugs, just almost anything you could imagine don't make it in because of the sanctions, because the accumulated reality of these OFAC lists that just make people feel whatever. And it's worse and worse when you don't have a total free market economy, and then the government officials, you know, are more directly involved.
I mean, it's even more than that. I mean, that's like what you just mentioned is all the sort of indirect, it's like the more direct consequences. It's also the fact that it crashes the economy.
Yep.
So like on top of having shortages of necessary items, whether it be medical goods, replacement parts for medical equipment, or replacement parts for trucks, right?
Yep.
Or whether it's your ability to get fuel into the country, it also crashes the economy. So the currency becomes like worthless. And you have to walk around with massive wads of cash because it becomes worthless by the day. And people's salaries go from being, you know, $500 a month to being $50 a month to being $10 a month because everything's tied to the US dollar. So it's like so much, like you can't even, and then it's just the daily humiliation and insecurities. Like in Lebanon right now, I have 13 hours of electricity a day, and I'm super lucky, right? Like I'm one of the lucky ones. Half my day, I don't have electricity, and my day is consumed by electricity cuts and when it means I can do certain things versus when I can't. When I have to go take my laptop to some cafe because I can't charge it here. When I have to, you know, get up in the middle of the night and turn on a battery operated fan because the AC went out and it's really hot outside. You're just constantly running around like a chicken with your head cut off.
No,
and that's for like lucky
Didn't you
people.
one time have to set up like a tent and a battery powered light to do like an interview? I just remember thinking like, this just seems unbelievable that this is the case. I mean, but you know, it sounds absurd and we're laughing, but it does just show like it really does shape every single part of your life, of everyone's life, really, in terms of just the things that a lot of us take for granted.
And then like imagine if you have a parent who's sick who needs something like dialysis. Imagine if you have a parent who needs something so basic like maybe blood pressure medication. Like things like that run out because most countries like don't manufacture their own medications, right? So like if you have like your dad or mom, like your life just, and that's what I'm watching in Lebanon. People's lives become consumed with basic survival, right? Every single day is just like this uphill battle. And it's like these people who are making these decisions are doing it. They're some of the richest, most powerful, most comfortable people in the world.
Yes.
Are making these decisions in air-conditioned boardrooms in Washington, D.C., and on K Street. And they are making decisions that immiserate millions and millions of people and kill God knows how many. We know that in 2 years in Venezuela, 40,000 people died as a result of U.S. sanctions in just 2 years. And that's
the cognitive
was based on a
dissonance
study.
of it.
Just
Want to quickly
No, go ahead.
shout someone out. I mean, it's important that I interrupt you to tell you. Shout out to Choo
I
Choo
get
M,
fired
who
up.
donated in the super chat and said, "You two are my favorite people to listen to." So I had to interrupt you, Rania, just to make sure you could be heard. But no, shout out to you. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. But no, I think the point you're making about the cognitive dissonance of people's lives is so true. I mean, I don't know where Janet Yellen lives, the current Treasury Secretary, but I do know where Steve Mnuchin lived, the former Treasury Secretary. And the zip code he lived in is this tiny little triangle just below the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. At one point was the richest zip code in the country. And it just gives you a sense, this is the person. But why don't we just move forward here as we continue to, and of course, we got a few more things coming up here later in the show. We're going to be talking with some Iraq War veteran who interrupted George W. Bush. We're going to be talking with Vijay Prashad about some of the things happening with the U.S.-China Cold War. But now we want to turn back here to the state of New York, to Saratoga Springs in particular, where Black Lives Matter activists are being arrested, targeted by police there in Saratoga Springs, and we are very honored to have with us here on the show from Saratoga Black Lives Matter, Lexis Figuereo and TJ Sangare with us here on the show. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
No, the pleasure is really all ours. Now, I think a lot of people might not be paying attention to Saratoga Springs and haven't maybe fully seen what has happened. So, Lexis, I'll start with you. What is the situation there? What has taken place in terms of the arrest and how y'all are being targeted?
I mean, right now we've had 12 people arrested so far. There's supposedly a investigation of a July 14th protest that we had, which was a protest after we had not had protests for about 2 months or so, 3 months. We were doing nothing but community events. The assistant chief, John Catone, ended up making some racist statements, pretty much blaming BLM for the crime wave in Saratoga Springs, which is there's not much of a crime wave. And we have nothing to do with any of that crime. We're actually anti-violent, and we believe in anti-violence. So now we're being targeted. Me personally, I was pulled over for a disorderly conduct. Which is, a violation. And I was pulled over. I had a little tree in my window. They said you had a tree in the window, get pulled over by 2 cop cars, get detained for about 8 hours, 9 hours, and this is what they're doing. They're doing this to a lot of us, and it's terrible. They're trying to shut us up.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, it certainly, wow. The tree and you think everyone has that. TJ, tell us, what your situation has been. And I think as Lexis was saying, from what I've been reading, it seems like this has been par for the course. They're just snatching y'all up and bringing people in and holding them for long series of hours.
Yeah, they're doing whatever they want. I've been at school in northern Vermont, so when everyone started getting arrested, I got a call about it, and not soon after that, I was informed that I would also be another person who had a arrest warrant out for them, and so I had to drive 3 hours home from school, miss classes, go turn myself in, get booked, mugshot, get held in handcuffs and the belt like I was a violent offender, and I had to go all the way down there just so that they could put on a little show for themselves and feel good.
Yeah, I mean, it's some of the photos and the video I saw there. And, one of the things that I saw mentioned, either of you can take this, and maybe you both know, also is that they were refusing to allow people to wear masks once they have been arrested. So, I mean, essentially forcing people to be overexposed to COVID?
Yeah, for sure. When I was arrested, I wasn't offered a mask. I didn't have a mask when I was in there. So I was in there for about 8 to 9 hours. And I know somebody who was held overnight. They asked for a mask, and the officer said no. I mean, I was actually, denied medical care as well while I was there. So, they definitely wasn't worried about no mask.
Wow. Well, TJ, tell me a little bit more about the organizing y'all are doing, because I think that's always a key question I have in these situations, because I assume when I see these things happen that they're actually concerned about the impact that's being had.
Right. Like you'd think that the streets are on fire or something, but on the contrary, a lot of times you'll find us in the park having community events, free food drives, educational events. We did Narcan training. We did some EMS training. On top of that, we'll be marching in the streets sometimes, but like Lex said, we weren't even out that much this past summer, especially. And it's just crazy because all this is just to stop from for them to stop the truth coming out and for them to stop an investigation. And they're just going to do whatever it takes.
Lexis, I could guess the answer to this question, but I think so many people have seen the uprising that took place last year, the broader movement for Black Lives over the past few years. Are the police in Saratoga Springs more or less like the police everywhere else in terms of racism and brutality?
I would have to say more. And I would say more because they've been, held to this standard and never been held accountable ever for any of their actions. There's a few different deaths by the hands of police that have never been investigated ever, including Daryl Mount, 2013. Anybody can Google that name. A lot of stuff comes up about that. The boy supposedly fell from 19 feet scaffolding on a chase from the police. Ends up, with marks only to his head, in a coma for 9 months till he ends up dying. 21-year-old boy. So this is what we're fighting. And, we're fighting for that investigation. That's our number one priority in Saratoga Springs. They don't want that.
Mm-hmm. No, that's crucial. And, I don't know what you all think about this, but I know that I believe there was a hearing last night in the city council, and there's some discussion about a civilian review board and other pieces like that. How do you all feel about that? Is that just window dressing, something you'd like to see?
I mean, we've been talking about a civilian review board since last year when they put down the police task force, when the Cuomo made the executive order 203. We were at every single one of those meetings, including for Saratoga County and for the city of Saratoga Springs. We had 50 recommendations that were supposed to be put forth by the task force, and the city council adopted them, but they didn't actually implement them yet. This is about a year later now. We're still waiting for them to be implemented. Who knows if it ever happens? They were fighting for a civilian review board for the last 10 to 12 years in Saratoga Springs. They've been denied every time.
Wow. TJ, I think you spoke to this already a little bit in terms of having to come back to school and be arrested and all of these different pieces. Talk a little bit, if you could, just about the human toll of this, because one of the things that I've found frustrating about the coverage that I've seen is like, oh, well, they're only being arrested for this or that misdemeanor, basically making it seem like this isn't that serious. It's not a big deal. People shouldn't be outraged. And so just if you could talk a little bit about that human impact of being caught up in this.
Well, yeah, and I think you just said it. Like, they make it feel like it's not a big deal, and people try to stress that point, like, oh, like, you're gonna be fine. Like, it's only this, it's only that, and at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what it is because it's not okay. And this is a real slippery slope, because as soon as people allow them to do this and allow them to do that, then it's gonna turn into something that we don't want to see. Mm-hmm. And and like you said, we're humans. Like, we're not out here for fun. We're not out here just to mess around. Like, we're out here because we care. And it's crazy seeing this.
Mm-hmm. No, it absolutely is. I mean, it feels almost through the looking glass. I can tell you, in protest, I've blocked every single major street in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, in the middle of rush hour, and was never arrested. So the idea that people are being criminalized for something like this is just outrageous. Lexis, talk a little bit about what's next for Saratoga BLM. I mean, I know you all aren't going to stop fighting. So, what are some of the things moving forward that people can be looking for?
I mean, we have a event this Sunday actually in Congress Park in Saratoga Springs. It's actually called Cookies and No Cops. It's going to be a mutual aid event. We're going to be doing donations and stuff like that, but we're going to have a lot of free items. Obviously, it's mutual aid. Everything's free. People are welcome to donate towards our cause for our legal funds and things like that. But besides that, we're going to have food there, free food, drinks, live music as well. Once again, our community-driven events that we were doing. So that's all we have for right now, besides asking people to continue to, keep emailing these DAs, emailing the AGA, and getting our story out for sure. Our assistant chief, like I said, Gatone, said that he was going to use 130 years of his family's power to, change our narrative. And our narrative is that, Daryl Mount's investigation should happen, and that the police should be held accountable.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm sure there's probably plenty of people watching around the country, watching around the world who'd like to follow what y'all are doing. Where can they find you on social media or on the internet and offer their support?
They can follow us at Saratoga Black Lives Matter, and that's going to be on Instagram and on Twitter and on Facebook as well. We have a private group on Facebook where we're putting up a public one in the next few days. And you can follow me at L Figuereo on Facebook, Instagram, all that stuff. So keep following us. We'll keep you up to date. We always keep the post up to date. We always respond.
Right on. Well, hey, I really appreciate y'all giving us some of your time. Really appreciate all the work that you were doing. Lexis, TJ, Saratoga, Black Lives Matter. Really appreciate you joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, Rania, I mean, of course, this is another constant theme for us, is the ridiculous harassment of police, of activists, and of course, the communities themselves. So really appreciate that. That's Saratoga Springs, Black Lives Matter. Everyone, please go support them. As I think there's been 14 people arrested so far. Even though if you Google it, they say it's a bunch of misdemeanors. It's a lot of charges that are being put on people, tons of harassment, and really just a disgusting situation. And go ahead, Rania.
Well, I was just gonna say, I just came up with I'm just gonna tell you, I came up with a terrible segue for our next guest.
Oh,
based on what you just said, but
if it's a terrible segue, are you sure? Do you want to think about it?
No.
Is there like a devil's advocate you want to ask?
No. It was a sarcastic segue.
Oh Lord. Okay. Well, before you segue, can I just shout out a couple of people?
Yeah.
Ain't Signals from Vega. Maybe that's a galactic reference, but shout out to you. I think coming all the way from Australia. So big on that. Really appreciate you. I feel like it's, early in the morning. So thank you. I have no idea what time it is in Australia, but it feels like you made a sacrifice to watch us. So extra shout out to you. And they'd like to hear more from Rania about her experience of sanctions in Lebanon. Rania actually already typed to me, oh, Trish, your name is here. Perfect. From Tasmania. Oh, wow. This is big. We in Tasmania now.
Yeah.
But Trish, I want you to know, Rania has already messaged me and said we're going to do a whole segment actually on sanctions and talk more about what's going on in Lebanon. So we're going to do our absolute best to get you there.
Stay tuned.
Lygia F. Hopefully I got that right. Shout out to you. Thank you so much. Loves our work. Thank you again. Asking us to discuss the Puerto Rico U.S. colonial junta's forced electric grid privatization, which is a huge issue there. Very high rates, houses burning. A couple of people have contacted us about that issue, and so we are going to try to bring that up. Harry C. Smith, you also made a donation. Shout out to you as well. I think also from Australia. We're doing it big in the land down under this week. Well, we want to, go to our next issue, and this is we're going to be joined by Mike Prysner in just a bit, who is I'm sorry. I was gonna.
But Mike, can I tell you what my segue was going to be for Mike?
Please. Oh my
You're trying to go
God.
past that. No, I have to. It was because this is funny. I promise. And if
Is
it's
it?
not,
Because when you have to say it's funny,
not.
that usually. But go ahead.
Because you were talking about harassment of people, like legit harassment, and I was just thinking about the harassment of George W. Bush. Night after night, the poor man is just trying to get a speech out, and he's constantly being reminded that he killed millions of people. I mean, it's just not right. It's harassment. It's bullying.
Wow,
it was someone.
Rania.
No, people tried to portray it that way. People did try to.
No,
that's why
people
I thought
did try
it
to
was
portray
funny.
it that way. Well, we want to bring Mike on, but I think we have a clip of what happened. I want to just actually play a little bit of that for context for those who may have missed it. I think it was a very important moment that took place there a couple days ago.
Mr. Bush, when are you going to apologize for the million Iraqis that are dead because you lied? You lied about weapons of mass destruction. You lied about connections to 9/11. You lied about Iraq being a threat. You sent me to Iraq. You sent me to Iraq in 2003. My friends are dead. Joshua Castile. You killed people. You lied. You lied about WMDs. A million Iraqis are dead because you lied. My friends are dead because you lied. You need to apologize. Apologize.
So
Well, we're joined by the man himself, Mike Prysner, friend of the show, producer for the Empire Files, Iraq War veteran, of course, also an organizer against the Iraq War for many years. It's actually how we know each other. Mike, thank you so much for being with us here on the show.
Happy to be back. Good joke,
Well,
Rania.
Yeah, thank
I
you.
support
Thank
your-
you. Thank
I
you.
support your segue.
Yeah.
I have to say, I hear people getting upset, but I thought it was excellent.
Well,
I just
all
wanna
I can
say
say
it
is
was
this shows that
excellent,
Mike
incredible,
truly is a
clever.
good person with a kind heart that he actually went with you on that one.
No, he agreed. It was funny, but also can I tell you guys something, Mike? My first thought upon watching your video, okay, I watched it like 30 times because it was so satisfying and important what you did, but I just couldn't get past the people at the end. You see that row of people, just like zombies. They like kind of look as you're being taken out and like no expression on their face whatsoever. And then they look back kind of just satisfied that you've been removed from the crowd. So anyways, I just wanted to point that out to ask you, like, what was the feeling as you were being, do you even remember like the look on people's faces? Were they even receptive to what you were saying?
Yeah. Well, I mean, funny enough, it's kind of like one of those blackout moments where I don't have a strong memory of what happened in the moment. I do remember that the security guards that dragged me out, though, as soon as we got out of the theater and I was no longer being a disturbance and they were just carrying me out, I said to them, I was like, that guy's bad, right? And they're like, oh yeah, no, we hate him. And so they took me out very nicely. And then apparently the event the women that you see attacking me in the video were organized. They're the owner of the business that did the event. So they were very, very mad. But then they were apparently, after I left, my friend Marisa, who was filming, said that after I got kicked out, the women who attacked me were like yelling at the security guards, being like, why did you let him go? Why didn't you have him arrested? And so there was some drama afterwards about the fact that I had some support from the security at the event, who just worked at the theater. I mean, they weren't like Bush's security or working for the company. It was just the venue security who, I think also agreed with what I was saying.
Yeah.
But definitely the crowd was not.
No, well, I mean, if you're going to pay to see George Bush, I'm just going to assume you're a terrible person. It just seems like I'm going to let that one ride. Why was it important for you to do this, Mike? I mean, I'm sure you do a lot of important work on a lot of different fronts. You could have probably been a million different places. Why was it important for you to be in that theater?
Yeah, I saw Bush was speaking in LA, and I thought that he didn't really do speaking events a lot, but I learned afterwards that he's done over 200 public speaking events since he left office. And his rate for speaking events is in the ballpark of $175,000, which means just in speaking fees alone, he's made around $35 million since leaving office. And so speaking at this event in Beverly Hills, of course, as soon as we saw he was speaking here and in Long Beach. And so, of course, we immediately called a demonstration to protest outside. And just out of curiosity, I looked at tickets to the event. And funny enough, there was a lot of tickets still available. Even when I was there, the event was like 75% capacity. I mean, even getting $175,000 honorarium, that's obscene. But for ex-presidents like Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, they get like $700,000 per speaking event. So Bush is still very much in kind of like a D-list ex-president category. The events were not sold out. And so when I saw that there were seats available, even though they were quite expensive, I mean, my ticket, I spent over $1,000 to be able to get into the event. But I think the reason that I did it is because I felt it wasn't enough to protest outside. I felt like a deep responsibility to Iraqi people, to the myriad of communities that were affected by Bush, from Muslims in the United States, survivors of Katrina, people in Afghanistan, of course, people in Iraq, most of whom, all of whom suffered at Bush's hand, and to the many of families and friends that I've made along the way in the anti-war struggle. Families that have lost loved ones in combat in Iraq, to suicide, to drug overdose, to war wounds that they died from years after returning. Many people who I knew in the anti-war struggle. When I referenced my friends are dead because you lied, I was lucky enough that none of my friends were killed in Iraq when I was there. Of course, many of my friends were wounded and had serious psychological issues that I've been, trying to help them through for the many years after the war. But, many people who I became close with and became friends and colleagues with, returning and becoming active in the anti-war struggle, they died from the Iraq war, from other types of things. The one name that I got to read, because I had a list of names of Americans and Iraqis who died in Bush's war. The one name I got to read, I thought was a good example. It's someone named Joshua Castile. He was in the first year of the Iraq war like myself. Him and I were on the same panel together at the Winter Soldier hearings. He became a conscientious objector and got himself kicked out of the army for refusing to go back to Iraq. But he died in 2012 of an aggressive brain cancer that he got from burn pits. Why did he get brain cancer from burn pits? Because not only did George Bush lie us into a war and cause all these people to die based on a lie, but he also turned the Iraq war into a money-making operation. So he gave contracts to companies like Halliburton and Kellogg Brown and Root to do things like trash disposal, which of course was doing as much profit maximization as possible. So they burned all this trash with high temperature fuel, which was completely knowingly a deadly, toxic thing to do. And it was all U.S. soldiers and Iraqis living nearby who breathed in all the fumes. And it was so bad that actually more veterans are going to die from burn pit exposure than all of the veterans who were killed in combat, or all the soldiers who were killed in combat combined. And the reason I'm happy I got to read Joshua Castile's name is because I want people to learn his story. But just before his death, when he knew that his time was over, he said something that I found very powerful. He said, he was asked how he felt about his illness and dying from burn pits from Bush's war. And he said, I actually feel grateful. He said, I feel grateful that I get to share in the suffering of the Iraqi people who are far more exposed to this smoke and will have to be on their deathbed in a much less comfortable situation than I was. So that kind of solidarity that he felt with the suffering of the Iraqis brought on by Bush. And so it was people like him, other friends that we lost along the way, people like Thomas Young, people like Jacob David George, others who dedicated themselves to anti-war struggle after returning from the war, who then ended up succumbing to the wounds that they incurred there. So the responsibility I felt to those people, and of course, to the millions of Iraqis whose life has been totally shredded and destroyed by the war and continue to live in that nightmare, I felt I had no other choice but to do what I did.
Mm-hmm.
I also appreciate that you did mention Iraqis, because so often when we talk about the consequences of these wars in Afghanistan and Iraq in the mainstream, they're always left out. And Iraq is, of course, as we all know, still dealing with the consequences of just a completely shattered country that's been drained of all of its professionals and most of its resources, and has just an extremely corrupt government that America set up for them. But all that said, I couldn't help but notice that, 2 nights in a row, George W. Bush gave a speech where he was paid very handsomely, despite being, like you said, a D-list ex-president. You interrupted on one night, and then the next night he was interrupted by Jeb Sprague, our friend and researcher, whose cousin is still suffering consequences from having served in Iraq. Of course, that there isn't video of that, except there is video of George Bush reacting to it on stage. But I couldn't help but notice that it was ignored. I mean, it seems like a pretty big deal if night after night a former president is being heckled over allying us into war. I mean, what do you think that's about? Why did the media just not pay any attention? I mean, they usually like spectacle. This was spectacle. So where was the media on this? I mean, I know you've been asked to come in and give some interviews, but also what's that been like? Where have you gone on to interview? Are you getting a lot of phone calls?
Yeah, to be honest, none from the mainstream media at all. I think Al Jazeera is like the most mainstream outlet. I know BBC Arabic aired it and aired also Jeb Sprague's disruption the next day, which I will say I almost like it better to see Bush's face during the disruption than, the person that's disrupting. I think that was actually kind of more illuminating to see Bush's reaction of like laughing and smiling and waving as this man recounted how his family was impacted by his war. But I think the reason that mainstream media hasn't really covered it so far, I mean, who knows? I mean, it's still getting out there in a big way. But I think it's because, this in the immediate aftermath of a presidency, of course, it's easy to reject a president. Like if you remember back to the 2008 Republican National Convention, Bush couldn't speak at it. I mean, he was even toxic to his own party. So in the immediate aftermath of a presidency, you see if they were a bad president, like Trump is experiencing now, you see the kind of, that's not who we are this new face. But the entire institution of the presidency itself is something that the mainstream media and those that want to project this idea of stability and strength as a country or whatever, the lauding of ex-presidents is something that is like required. And so the rehabilitation of Bush wasn't just because people just came around and said, oh, you know what, actually, he wasn't so bad because Trump was worse. It's important for the system of imperialism and capitalism to say we have this great political system. And even if we have disagreements between these two parties, as a whole, the institution is good and it's strong. And so they needed to rehabilitate Bush to not, be embarrassed as a country and as a capitalist institution. And so that's what the effort has been. And so to cover what I did would then have to bring all those questions back about the entire Bush era, all of the wars that we are still living in the wake of. And that's a difficult thing for this system and this establishment to want to highlight. Of course, they don't want to highlight because it's a major blight on their record.
Yeah. No, I think it's a good point. And I mean, it just seems like so much of this as well in the context of this. And, one of the reasons I was actually very glad to see what happened, in terms of what you did, what Jeb did. Also want to just connect this to an earlier story. We talked about Haiti. Jeb Sprague has done a lot of great work on Haiti. And so definitely check him out on that earlier issue as well for those who were with us earlier in the show. But one of the things that I thought was important to me about this, Mike, is that there's been this sort of Bush rehabilitation issue around Trump. And it's sort of, people basically saying, well, Bush really wasn't that bad. We've seen every neocon revive themselves as, a liberal hero because they were against Trump. I mean, I won't even go down the laundry list of terrible people. And I thought that this was such an important just re-injection and reminder for people, especially younger people who do remember the terribleness of Trump, but not Bush, and forget what really happened, but really just sort of an important disruption of this sort of narrative change of Bush into some sort of, and this goes back, the Michelle Obama giving him the throat lozenge and all that kind of stuff. This rehabilitation of Bush is somehow, I don't know, almost like some sort of progressive or something like that, the way some people would talk about him.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very deliberate campaign. I mean, doing the rounds on different talk shows like Jimmy Kimmel and Ellen and so forth. I think that what's been encouraging to me in the reaction to this, I mean, number one, to see it go viral among Iraqi people was, of course, the most meaningful. I mean, I would be very understanding if I was rejected by that community, having been an occupying soldier in Iraq. But the fact that so many Iraqis, including the man who threw his shoes at Bush, has reached out to me and is very supportive, that of course means the world to me, and was the most heartening thing out of the whole thing. But the fact that it's so popular among young people, like high school age people, I mean, people that were not alive or were babies when Bush was doing the things that he was doing. And I think I think the popularity of the thing, partially it is like a hatred of Bush. And those of us who have such a deep memory of the Bush wars and the torture program and all of those things, it's satisfying to see someone say to his face what all of us wish we could say to his face. Like, you need to beg for your forgiveness at the very least. But I think that on the other hand, the other reason that it's popular, especially with people who don't have much of a memory of Bush, is a desire for militancy and militant action. And it doesn't have to be about Bush. I mean, there's so many problems that we're dealing with as a country. I mean, from the pandemic, the economic crisis, eviction crisis, like access to a decent life, the kind of state of forever war, even though Biden just stood before the UN General Assembly and said for the first time in 20 years, we're no longer at war, yet we are waging war across the Middle East, Africa, and so forth. I think that people see that there are problems. And to see that and the support for an action that is militant, small action, I think it was empowering for people because, I didn't do that action by myself. I had my friend, my comrade Marisa with me, who was filming and who was fully expecting to get arrested at the action. And then there was dozens of people outside the event in support, holding a protest, who were prepared to run jail logistics in the event that we were arrested, which we expected. But it was still a small number of people. A less than a dozen people organized an action that was able to have national and international significance. And I think that the message that sends is that we don't need to have thousands and thousands of people in the streets to be effective. Of course, that helps, but you don't need it to be effective. And that people want militant confrontational action that fights for the values that we believe in. And so my hope is that resonance that it has for that reason can be an inspiration for other similar things to happen against Bush, but also others that we need to fight.
Yeah, I mean,
these people shouldn't be. Somebody got angry about
someone
Bush.
Dropped something and caught me off guard
somebody.
there.
No, I think that's a really good point though, because
in the Breakthrough News studio.
These people should not be able to walk around and live life comfortably as though they are totally normal. These are like sociopathic war criminals who are responsible not just for the destruction of Iraq. They're responsible for destruction of countries and the killings and murders of people all around the world in ways that, people can't even fathom. And so I think there's, along with like the desire for militancy, which I think you're absolutely right about, I think there's also like a real satisfaction people have, especially like Iraqis for one, but just in general, people, they take satisfaction in seeing what feels like somebody getting told to their face. It's like at the very least, that should be happening on a regular basis to people like George W. Bush, to people like Donald Rumsfeld, to this entire cabal of psychopaths that literally like almost, it's like what they did to the Middle East was the equivalent of taking an asteroid and just like throwing it at Earth, but like at a region and just completely destroying it. Like they brought about an entire new era. And the Middle East is still suffering from the ramifications of right now. And so, I mean, that's more of a comment of gratitude, because I think what you did, like, it is so important and it needs to be done more often. It needs to be done all the time, because unfortunately, these people are probably never going to see the inside of a jail cell, which is where they should be.
Yeah, and I like the cryon cuddly war criminal Bush. I think that his image of just this like bumbling old fool who was just in the wrong place at the wrong time and made some mistakes and is actually like personally like a lovable character. I mean, that's the kind of the way they've tried to rehabilitate him. But I think it's important, and this is why I included this in my disruption, for people to remember that these were very malicious lies. I mean, this wasn't a mistake. Yep. This wasn't a misstep. When you take so-called facts, when you take pieces of intelligence that you tell the world, and especially the country, that we have to invade Iraq because they have WMDs, knowing that that's a lie, and that if we don't act now, immediately, this was the line, the smoking gun could be a mushroom cloud.
Yep.
So what Bush was saying to the country was, Iraq has these weapons, we know that for a fact, and if we do not invade them now, right now, they are going to launch an attack that kills millions of Americans. That was a lie. All of them knew it was a lie. They knew the intelligence was fake. They knew they were not going to find any WMDs. They knew that was a lie. You don't call that a mistake. You call that a conspiracy to commit a crime, a conspiracy to commit murder. And that's why even if he can take this image of this, like, whatever guy, silly, cuddly guy, that's actually what he really did. And I think another reason it resonates is because, I mean, this guy, not only did he face no consequences, he has a very good and lucrative post-presidency career. Speaking engagements aside, the $35 million aside that he's made, he sells, the fact that he sells books of paintings of soldiers who died in Iraq, which is just like I couldn't even believe that was real when I heard it. It was just like, is this
What?
someone made this up, right? Someone had to have made this up. But it's real. He also, he owns a tree farm in Texas, like hundreds of acres of trees that he sells. He's like a tree salesman. So it's like weird stuff like this where it's like he has so many millions of dollars that were made off of his popularity as this person. And I think that of course, he's probably never going to see the inside of a jail cell unless we have a revolution, which, hopefully can happen in his lifetime. But I think that just the idea that for him to not be able to show his face and the justification for going and disrupting every time he speaks. And the message that I was trying to send was, at the very least, when you've done something wrong, when there's been an injustice, how do you repair that injustice? There is atonement and healing. And how do you have that? You have to have admissions that you did something wrong, apologies to the people that you hurt. I mean, that's a good starting point. And at the very least, Bush could do that. At the very least, Bush could admit, confess, I lied. I went off fabricated intelligence when I knew it was. I know that so many families have been destroyed and ripped apart by it. And I'm sorry. And that's, I was inspired to say that by Thomas Young, who was a soldier who was shot and paralyzed in Iraq. And he spent the rest of his life basically hounding Bush, like trying to demand that Bush meet with him and see the reality of what Bush's war did to people, young men like Thomas Young. And on his deathbed, right before he died of his complications from his injuries in Iraq, he said, "I hope before your time on earth ends, you have the moral courage to stand before the world and especially the Iraqi people and beg for your forgiveness." And so I wanted to relay that message from Thomas Young to Bush, because I think, that's a pretty good starting point for him to start to begin the process of healing that so many people need.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mike, I really appreciate that. I really appreciate, what you did. And also shout out to Jeb Sprague, friend of the show, also who disrupted the next night in Long Beach. Mike Prysner, producer for the Empire Files. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks, y'all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really is I can remember it like it was yesterday when they were telling us they had the WMD. I'll never forget on NBC Nightly News, Tom Brokaw.
Yeah, I remember my parents.
Saddam has these aluminum tubes that I don't know had something to do with, and they were like, we know he's got them, but they're like, we don't have a photo of the aluminum tubes, but we do have a rendering. And then they just brought up like a pencil drawing of something that looked like you could just buy it from Lowe's. And it was, I was just like, you got to be kidding me right now. Like aluminum tubes, but they were like deadly serious. This is the NBC Nightly News. This is Tom Brokaw. I mean, this is like the news. And somehow there's colored pencils.
And yellow cake. Remember yellow cake? They were like yellow cake from Nigeria. Something about yellow cake in Nigeria.
The pre for
yellow
uranium.
Cake from Niger.
But of course, we know that Joseph Wilson, of course, who blew the whistle on that, and then Dick Cheney outed his wife, CIA agent Valerie Plame. I mean, I don't know if you're a CIA agent. I don't know how bad I feel for you, but nevertheless, terrible movie. One of the worst movies I've ever seen. And I'm a Sean Penn fan, but I'm sorry. I'm sorry, my man. So
I will say, I remember, just real quick before we move on from here, I specifically will never forget the night that George Bush was announcing that we were about to start bombing, or that we had just started bombing Iraq, announcing shock and awe. I remember my parents, my whole family was glued to the TV. And what people don't realize is that that terrified the entire region, and anybody who was from there. Because it was understood that this was the beginning of a domino collapse of one country after another. Because that's what they were saying.
And
they were like,
next?
we got to take out
Syria,
Saddam.
everybody,
We got to take out
Iran.
Gaddafi. We got to take out
North
Assad.
Korea.
They were, Iran. Yeah, they were say all the axes of evil. We're going to go one country after another. And I just remember I think my mom may have cried. it was a frightening time for people across the Middle East, for people who had relatives in the Middle East. And again, it's, I got to do an episode on this too, but it's I can't even begin to describe how the region was reshaped. It was this situation, what the U.S. did in Iraq, caused a ripple effect across the region that we are still living with today. Yep. So this man, George W. Bush, and his cabal of psychopaths, like I don't know how else to describe them,
Yes.
deserve to have like 10 Mike Prysners follow them around on a regular basis, like shouting at them that, you know, how terrible they are. And that's like a light sentence. But at the very least, that's what
I remember when
deserve.
David Petraeus was teaching at CUNY, and I don't know who these students were, shout out to you, and they were following him after he left. And there's this great video of one of them just saying, "Every day, David, every day." He subsequently quit and then went to Yale, and a class where you couldn't take notes because they didn't want people to know. Before we transition here and talk a little bit about the new Cold War with Vijay Prashad, we got to go quickly, so I'm sorry, but shout out to Chris Kelly, Jose Alvarado, and Abu Haram for donating in the super chat. Really appreciate y'all. Abu Haram, second time there. Really appreciate you absolutely being with us and donating. But we do want to shift gears here now to the quote-unquote Asia-Pacific region. Very happy to be joined as we continue the show here by the Executive Director of the Tri-Continental Institute, Vijay Prashad. Vijay, thank you so much for being with us.
Oh,
Vijay, you're muted.
I think.
It's me, sorry. Nice to be with you.
Very nice to be with you. To start off, Vijay, I want to just get your reaction here to something President Biden said at the United Nations General Assembly, sort of responding to this criticism of him for being too aggressive on China.
The United States will compete, and will compete vigorously, and lead with our values and our strength. We'll stand up for our allies and our friends and oppose attempts by stronger countries to dominate weaker ones, whether through changes to territory by force, economic coercion, technical exploitation, or disinformation. But we're not seeking, say it again, we are not seeking a new Cold War.
Well, I don't know, Vijay Prashad, did that sound believable to you, or are they not seeking a new Cold War?
Well, firstly, it's a welcome thing that he said they're not seeking a new Cold War. It's far better than if he had announced that the United States has started military operations against China. So I think we should take, even small mercies and celebrate them. Because, it is important, actually, guys, that Biden said this at such a public place, announced it fundamentally. And I hope that people, including the United States partners in Europe and elsewhere, in Japan, India, will hold the Biden administration to this, because he said it now. He said, we are not seeking a Cold War. Well, now the question is, how do you account for your behavior? If you're not seeking a Cold War, then what are you doing? I mean, what are you doing hosting the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Arrangement with Japan, India, and Australia? What are you doing having created the AUKUS, this new body, which in my mind is less a military pact with Australia and the United Kingdom and more an arms deal with Australia? But still, what are you doing with that? I think it's well worth asking why the US ally Japan has said, I think quite sharply, that they will take time to assess the Chinese membership in a major trade agreement, which China had applied for several years ago, actually. So it's well worth having us, pause and say, well, thanks, Biden. Thanks for saying you're not in a Cold War. At the same time, how do you account for this? And I would like to see him give us a measure of why the United States is willing to now spend, again, perhaps trillions of dollars, accelerating, ramping up the pressure campaign on China. What is that pressure campaign, if not a Cold War? How does one designate it? And I think that's now a question, for the White House to answer. But I do want to say my first reaction on hearing his speech, of course, we can quibble and say, Biden, everything you're saying about the unnamed adversary, China, you can't have territorial snatches and you can't put pressure on. Everything you're saying, Biden, is stuff the US does. I know we would like to quibble in that direction, but really that's not the headline from what he says, because that's always the hypocrisy of United States people in power. The real headline is that United States says it is not seeking a Cold War. Well, good for you. Now what?
Yeah.
I think...
You know...
Please.
Sorry. Okay. Well, I was just gonna, say I think that this is obviously happening with the backdrop of this Australia, UK, America deal that took place last week that made France very angry. And I just have to comment that it's very exciting for me when I see the West get angry at each other, because that means they're maybe a little bit too busy to attack the areas of the world that I live in for at least a couple days. But it was interesting to see this kind of pushback from France. Obviously, that sort of diplomatic row is coming to an end now. But I'm curious, what are your thoughts about what took place there, where France got very angry? They were left out of this deal. The U.S. kind of undermined them. And they even recalled their ambassadors. And it did seem, at least for a moment, that maybe this might mean a slight change in direction for the EU, or maybe more of an independent path for the EU when dealing with this U.S. Cold War with China.
Well, the first thing is, how long do we have? Because, you'd have to go back and dig into the early years of the Cold War. I mean, France has always had a separate foreign policy than the rest of Europe. It was what Charles de Gaulle had prided as a part of French sovereignty and so on. And Macron is just picking up on that. But honestly, the French did get really, really pushed aside in this. France in 2016 inked a deal with Malcolm Turnbull's government in Australia, a deal that would have amounted to about $90 billion in US dollars in the sale of diesel-powered submarine to Australia. France is one of the 5 or 6 countries in the world that can produce high-quality military submarines. And the French had at the time were very happy about that deal. Now, as soon as the deal was announced, Rupert Murdoch's various outlets started hammering against the French deal, saying that it's not going to be as good as if Electric Boat was building the submarines. That's the General Electric, submarine maker in Connecticut, and so on. I mean, Murdoch just went on a campaign against the French. Things got so bad earlier this year that when Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State of the US, visited Paris in late June of this year, Blinken, by the way, speaks French and used to live in France. So, Macron and Le Drian, the foreign minister, said, welcome home. And they were so kind to Blinken and so on. And they said to Blinken, listen, this submarine deal, we know there's a lot of pressure against it, but the submarine deal isn't a French-Australian deal. It's a US-French partnership because Lockheed is producing some of the intermediate components, desperate, begging the Americans not to screw the deal up. That was one side of what happened. On the other side, after Brexit, the UK has been very eager to have an independent foreign policy with the United States. By independent, I mean independent from Europe, not independent from other countries. In fact, to be very close to the United States. BAE Systems, which is the leading British arms manufacturer, got a contract to produce nuclear-powered submarines for the British Navy and makes very sophisticated military equipment. So the British government and the US government came to the Australians secretly, and that's key, and I don't even know how much Blinken knew in June, by the way. This is still not clear. But they came to the Australians secretly. They negotiated this deal secretly, a deal for which we don't have a price tag because it's about 30 nuclear-powered submarines. Don't get fooled by the nuclear-powered. It doesn't necessarily mean it's not going to carry nuclear warheads. These are nuclear warhead-capable submarines. It's just that because Australia is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and to the Treaty of Rarotonga, they can't actually say they are carrying nuclear warheads, but they're capable, these submarines. So what I'm trying to get at, guys, is that, you have a situation here where France was really taken away from a major, major arms deal. They stole it from under France. That's why I believe that AUKUS is an arms deal which masquerades as a military alliance because that's the only way they can get these kind of things through. If it was simply a commercial deal, the French would have had the right to be even more pissed. But now the Australians say, look, we needed better submarines for our military pact and so on and so forth. This is not a military pact. There was no need for a new military arrangement. The United States already has the Australians, the Japanese, Indians in the Quad, and the British essentially do whatever the Americans tell them to do. There was no need for this agreement. This is an arms deal. It's basically camouflage for an arms deal.
No, I think that's a very good point. Very good number of points, I should say, there. And I appreciate that. Shout out to Massimo Urban, who appears to be from Australia. So shout out to you for watching us, noting that Biden forgot the name of Scott Morrison, Prime Minister there of Australia. So it says more about Scott Morrison than Biden, really. Also, Meeling Wee also donated, shout out to you, saying that the anti-war groups in America should organize one big anti-war group and try to get more participation from ordinary Americans. And what's your thoughts on that issue, Vijay?
Well, there's a lot of things that should happen in the United States, as you know, Eugene. There needs to be a bigger left force. There needs to be a bigger this and a that and the other thing and so on and so forth. If you look at the levels of public protest, when Trump was elected, there was that major women's march, very important development, Lots of people, different backgrounds, liberals, people who had not been political, that put on that, pink hat and went to Washington, D.C. for the march and so on. After that march, I had a very nice conversation with Linda Sarsour, who was one of the organizers of the march. And I asked Linda, one interesting thing that seemed to be missing at the march was any anti-war voice. It was very much about domestic policy and to the good, because, the United States domestic policy arena has really gone in a direction which, it's almost hatred for its own population, if we're frank. 3 people killed a day by the police force, people struggling with hunger, homelessness, and so on and so forth. There's a lot to really salvage back to civilization domestically. So I'm not one of those people who says, it's a big fraud. No, there's nothing fraud about any of it. You want to increase funding to keep people in their homes, that's to the good. I'm not, I have an apartment. Why would I begrudge people having housing? That's bad attitude. But she said, look, the reason there was no anti-war force at the rally was because there really isn't an anti-war movement in the United States. Now, obviously, she's not saying that there's no anti-war movement in the United States. There are many anti-war fronts. Those exist. The problem is the credibility of the anti-war position is low. And the credibility of the anti-war position is low, not only because of the anti-war movement. It's not uniting. I don't think that's the problem. Disagreements over Syria and so on. I don't think that's the real issue. The real issue is that the communications industry, the media in the United States, has drilled down for the last 50 to 60 years into this patriotic seam, has drilled deep into patriotism and made it very hard to be critical of US foreign policy. To be critical of US foreign policy is tantamount to treason. And people just don't have the space to think about this. When you board a flight, they say, thank you for your service to servicemen and so on and so forth. That creates a culture of fear of being critical of the foreign policy agenda and so on. So I actually don't think the answer is have one big, anti-war movement. All those things are correct. You must do that. But it's a long and difficult cultural fight. Breakthrough is part of that fight. Trying to break through the discourse, trying to break through the debate, trying to say, look, it's acceptable to talk about, the Afghanistan debacle. It's acceptable to say you spent $2.26 trillion of American treasure on Afghanistan, and the day you were left, you had to leave in August. 3/4 of Afghan homes didn't have electricity. What did you spend the money on? I think it's well worth raising those issues. But I have to say that it's an uphill battle because you're fighting against every institutional force in society, which is coalesced around this idea that, look, United States might have homeless people on the streets, but it still has this proud, ability to go and smash other countries up and bring human rights and all this. Right. It's very hard to really push back against that in a mainstream way.
Mm-hmm.
Vijay, and I think something that I've seen you address as well, though, on this sort of like inter-left issue, at least, is this other uphill battle that goes along with what you're saying of dealing with these relentless campaigns to demonize whatever the official enemy is, whether it's China, whether it's Venezuela, whether it's Nicaragua, Syria, Iran, Iraq, whatever, pick a country. It's always this demonization campaign and this dehumanization and racist campaign that makes it much easier to just accept harsh policies against these countries. And then there is this divide that does take place on the left as a result of that, where on top of not wanting to go against foreign policy and seem anti-patriotic, it's also this really, I guess, fear of being accused of being like a dictator lover or a human rights abuser, or like dismissive of human rights abusers, or, you know, supporting genocide or whatever awful thing you can be called for simply opposing war.
Well, you know, you had a segment with Mike before I came on talking about Iraq. Now, let's review the facts. The United States started its most recent war against Iraq in 2003. In 2004, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan called it an illegal war. That's the United Nations considering the war illegal. Over roughly 1 million people, perhaps more, have died in that war. I don't know a house in Iraq where they haven't lost somebody to that war or had suffered some catastrophe, in that war. That's over 1 million people at least, country of 23, 24 million, minor country in the world, really, only 24 million. Think about that. India, 1.4 billion, Iran, 3 times the size of Iraq. Iraq is a small country. To take a clobbering from 1990, roughly, to the present, almost, over 1 million people killed. And yet, from, George H.W. Bush onwards, because that's when this Iraq war begins. Although, let's go back, to when the US egged on Iraq to go and invade Iran. That takes us back to Ronald Reagan. Every single president has been implicated in the mass murder of Iraqis, including in Halabja, when the Kurds were gassed by, Saddam's troops, but every weapon provided by West Germans and the United States, the chemical weapons. A sequence of US presidents responsible for mass murder in Iraq, and not one of these presidents is considered to be genocidal or will ever face any kind of, questioning even. I'm not even talking about trials and things like that, but questioning. No, we assume ipso facto that they're doing it to bring good to the world. Meanwhile, Muammar Gaddafi, without any evidence, is going to be a genocidaire. And why is Gaddafi a genocidaire? Because he's a dirty Arab. It's just a plain truth. Bashar al-Assad is not an ophthalmologist. He's just a dirty Arab. I mean, there's a lot of racism involved here. And let's also be clear. I make a lot of distinctions. I don't want to live under a theocratic government, any theocratic government. I don't want a religious government. I don't like religious governments. But that's the government there is. You don't have the right to bomb it. On the other hand, a country like Venezuela, which has a socialist process undergoing, I'm very much, in favor of the process that's undergoing. But what I'm trying to say is, even when I disagree with the process that's undergoing, that doesn't mean you should ever agree that that country should get bombed to smithereens. I thought Saddam Hussein was a thug, frankly, but that doesn't mean that I would ever say United States should go and bomb the living daylights out of the Iraqis, conduct human rights violations day and night. A horrible scenario. And I can't believe, frankly, I cannot ever believe when I hear people talk like that, when they say, well, it's the only way to get rid of Gaddafi. I mean, the callousness with which people speak. They know the fire that gets breathed out of the mouth of the dragon when it starts bombing a country like Libya or Iraq, destroys countries. How can you allow this to happen in your name? It's scandalous, And I'm afraid we don't actually criticize people who talk like that strongly enough. I think we're a little embarrassed of them because, they seem to take the high ground. And look, again, I'm coming back to Saddam 1990. This is a man whose government used chemical weapons against the Iranians, used chemical weapons against the Kurds. That doesn't mean that the United States should go and bomb that country to smithereens. And I did at the time, was very much against the first bombing in Iraq in 1991 and the human rights violations conducted by Norman Schwarzkopf's military as they bombed retreating Iraqi forces retreating from Kuwait. I mean, when are we going to account for these mass murders? The murder on the so-called highway of death. That's what the US troops called it, the highway of death. I didn't name it the highway of death. They proudly called it the highway of death. When are we going to call these people to account? And because we don't, and I'm not talking about the president's guys, I'm talking about the intellectuals, the media people who just cheerlead to war. We don't call them to account, don't hold their feet to a fire. Nothing is going to change. Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times, running, I believe, for governor in Oregon or somewhere, during the Afghanistan war, right in the Afghanistan war, he said that, the US must bomb Afghanistan. We'll save at least 1 million lives by doing so. In fact, Nick, the very opposite happened. Over 1 million people died because of US bombing. And it would be a disgrace if he becomes an elected leader in any state in the United States.
No, I agree. Well, I won't get into my election prognostications. Vijay Prashad, Executive Director of the absolutely essential Tri-Continental Institute. If you're not following Tri-Continental, you better start. Really appreciate you giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Well, Rania, that brings us to the end here. As always, I wish I had like a Mr. Rogers way to say that.
Well, I'll tell you something. I'll say that got me fired up. I feel like that we need to have a pep talk like that every day, because it's utterly unacceptable, the level of destruction and impoverishment and just complete horror shows around the world that the US government is responsible for causing with little to no pushback. And that needs to change. That really needs to change, especially as we enter this era of, what we were essentially talking to Vijay about in the beginning, which is this new Cold War with China, which is going to result in a lot of hot wars. Yes. That's what happens in Cold Wars. There's a Cold War between two big powers, but it plays out with these much hotter wars, like what we saw with the US coup in Guinea, which we discussed on the show a couple weeks ago, where the U.S. is actually going to go around and destabilize countries and impoverish them further and bully them to try to hurt China. And we're going to see more and more of that. And we need to, as people who oppose war, like that needs to be on our radar. And we do need to be going after these intellectuals, these pundits. And, I didn't know Nick Kristof, by the way, was running for governor. I had no idea.
He's putting out a lot of feelers. He's putting out a lot of feelers. A few stories emerged last week.
Jesus.
The current governor, Kate Brown, is term limited, but also the Attorney General of Oregon is probably going to enter, maybe mount a strong campaign. But yeah, it seems like Kristof may be trying to clear the field and might have leaked some of those stories himself. But that's a story for another time. That's going to bring us to the end here. You can go to patreon.com/breakthrough news. Support all of our fantastic coverage of everything from Lebanon to imperialism to AUKUS to the Oregon Democratic Party primary to what's going on in the streets in terms of the struggle against police terrorism to what's going on inside of the prisons and the struggle of those who are fighting for their human rights on the inside. Everything under the sun that is relevant to break through, if you will, all of the unbelievable capitalist propaganda that's out there. Patreon.com/breakthrough news. Patreon.com/breakthrough news. I'm Eugene Puryear. Next to me is Rania Khalek. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week.